Hello there. So, this is my book review, and the book I've chosen to read and review was this one. It's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering by Timothy Keller. So, to, I guess, summarise, I got this book in 2019. No idea what was coming in 2020, and it turned out to be quite a timely read, to be honest, because, well, I know a lot of people didn't find 2020 easy, and the problems are still ongoing. I know I didn't find it easy, and yeah, neither did my family. And reading this book actually was a great source of comfort throughout that time, and it really helped me with a lot of issues that we were all facing then. So, to give an overview of this book, it addresses the question: how do we as Christians deal with pain and suffering? And although it sounds like a simple question, the answer is very complex, very multifaceted, and I'm glad that the book treats the subject with the complexity it deserves. It doesn't give glib answers or simple solutions because there are none. And so I would thoroughly recommend people read it. In terms of what the book is like, it is divided up into three parts. The first part very much takes the question of suffering from an kind of intellectual or philosophical point of view. For example, it kind of thinks about the question that unbelievers often pose, which is how can a good and loving God permit so much suffering? And does that mean God doesn't exist? Does that mean he doesn't care? It addresses this question by thinking about lots of different cultures throughout history and how different historical cultures have thought about suffering. For example, people who believe in reincarnation make sense of suffering by saying it's a penalty for a sin in the past life, and one must try and live a better life to get a better life next time. Or some cultures believe in fate, and they say, well, to do this, to endure this suffering is your destiny. Whereas, and this is Tim Keller's main point in the first part, is in the West, in modern times, we don't really have much of a context or a framework to help us to deal with suffering. We don't have a way of explaining it like previous generations have done. And this leaves us not being able to rationalise suffering. We see it as something to be avoided at all costs. And if we can't avoid it, to minimise it as much as possible. He quotes people like Richard Dawkins, who say that, well, as he's an atheist, doesn't believe in God, that the universe is governed by blind chance and the laws of physics, and so therefore any suffering we experience, well, what did we expect? That's what we should expect from an indifferent universe. We shouldn't be too outraged when bad things happen to us or to our loved ones because, well, that's kind of the way it is. And I find that very helpful because, yes, it is hard to be a Christian sometimes when things go wrong. But this kind of showed me that actually it makes it almost impossible to be an atheist because you don't then have a framework for dealing with suffering. I'll just go and read a little bit from one of the chapters. And Tim Keller says, in summary, the problem of senseless suffering does not go away if you abandon belief in God. If there is no God, why have a sense of outrage and horror when unjust suffering occurs to any group of people? Violence, suffering and death are completely natural phenomena. On what basis do you say that cruelty is wrong? If there is no God or divine higher law, then violence is perfectly natural. So, abandoning belief in God doesn't help with the problem of suffering at all, and, as we will see, it removes many resources for facing it. So yeah, Tim Keller points out the question of why would a loving God permit such evil is kind of a contemporary phenomenon. People from ages past didn't really have that problem because they didn't believe it was God's role to make human beings happy, and previous generations had a better idea about how the universe was, and that constant happiness is not the normal or expected state. So that's part one, which was very helpful. However, parts two and three are very different, and I actually got most of the sort of comfort from the book from parts two and three. Part two talks about the kind of the deep questions of the heart, if you like. Not so much intellectual arguments, more kind of when our hearts cry, well, why God? Why me? Why has this happened? And what should I do? It talks about how not all suffering is the same. Suffering can be very different. One can know why one is going through something. For example, sometimes someone's suffering because you've done something wrong. Sometimes you're suffering because you're being opposed for the gospel, for example. And these are kind of easy to rationalise, but there are also types of suffering. For example, what Job went through, where he could not see the point. He didn't know why he was going through what he was going through. Chapter 2 kind of covers the responses to this and goes very much through the why of why things happen, and how God is sovereign over all these things and is perfectly capable of turning evil for good. And we don't always know why. We don't always have the reasons, and sometimes we do never see the reasons, but we shouldn't expect to, because God, being God and in charge of the universe and with knowledge of everything that goes on, he cannot reveal his whole plan to us. And so we kind of should be content with knowing what we know. It's difficult for me to express it as well as Tim Keller does, because he expresses it very well, and I'm probably not doing him justice at all. But that part of the chapter I found very helpful, and the whole part on that response to it was very comforting. Part 3, I guess, is a more practical stage of the book. It goes about our response to suffering, again very much from the point of view of the sufferer. It says that in the Bible there's a lot of weeping and lamenting and crying out to God, and he says that this is an appropriate response that perhaps we've kind of lost in our contemporary Western church. We don't sort of see lamenting as something to do very often, whereas in the Bible there are plenty of incidences of people calling out to God, and there's sort of no resolution where there's a happy ending. The Psalms, for example. There's other responses to suffering. It says how suffering can be a great teacher. It can help us reorder our priorities in life. For example, if you're going after the wrong things, even if those things aren't necessarily bad things, then when our hopes are dashed, it can really crush us. But maybe the problem was all along that we were going after these things rather than God. If I'm going to have any criticism at all, it's that sometimes I feel he's a little bit overly dismissive of what the world offers in terms of suffering. For example, I don't know, doing something that makes you feel good in order to cheer yourself up. He's very dismissive of that, whereas I would say that actually that approach isn't entirely bad, because feeling better in the moment can be a stepping stone to locking horns with the bigger problem and thinking about why you're suffering in detail. But I would agree with him that these kind of short-term quick fixes are not long-term solutions for any kind of pain and suffering. Each chapter nicely brings it home by giving a personal testimony of someone who's had a very kind of tragic life story and how God helped them through it. And there definitely works to read because it brings it all home. So in summary, I would say do read this book or download it on audiobook, which is what I did. I didn't actually read this print version of the book. I listened to the audiobook. And it is great, and it's very helpful whether you're going through suffering, but also if you're not, because it provides you with the kind of resources that you will need should the hard times arise. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and take care.